So this week, the United States decided to start a war. Congress is trying to pass the SAVE Act, which would kick tens of millions of eligible voters off, or it would cause issues. The DOJ was caught hiding more Epstein files that implicate the President of the United States, Donald Trump, for sexually assaulting a 13-year-old girl. ICE has a phone app that uses your Medicaid records to figure out where you live so they can show up at your door. We know that the Pentagon is looking to get unbridled access to AI for various reasons. And all of that leads up to this one thing. Our own fucking government is trying to kill us, all of us. Hi, welcome back to Radical Leftist Scum. I'm your host, Valdet Salimai. There's so much to talk about, so let's get into it. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time. I'm glad you're here, even though I wish, honestly, it were under better circumstances. We've got like 5 topics to talk about, and they're all connected by the same thread. A government that's accelerating its own power while making it harder and harder for ordinary people to do anything about it. We're talking about the Epstein files, the Save America Act, ISIS surveillance, and Operation Epic Fury, also known as Operation Epstein Fury, the war in Iran, the Pentagon. I've got a bunch of sources and links for everyone in the show notes. So if there's anything I say that sounds too wild to be true, go read it for yourself. Because in this timeline, the more wild it is, the more likely it's true. And that's the sad reality. So let's start with Epstein. I have to start with Epstein because I just cannot allow us to get comfortable or resign to the fact that a cabal of pedophiles run this country, run this world. We're at war because of it. They sexually abuse, rape children, they kill children, they eat children, and we have to pay taxes. We have to go about our day as if like that's normal. No, we can't accept that. So I want to talk about the Epstein files. So let's just refresh the background on that. We know that Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act last November, and it was bipartisan, and it was forced through using a discharge petition by Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie because leadership was trying to block it. Trump signed it, and the law required the DOJ to release all of its Epstein files within 30 days. What we got on December 19th was a dump that members of both parties called inadequate. So Representative Thomas Massie, who is a Republican, by the way, said it grossly fails to comply with both the spirit and the letter of the law. The DOJ then released over 3 million more pages at the end of January. Right, and we know what's in them. Well, a lot. Prince Andrew appears 100 times, or hundreds of times in the files. There are emails between Epstein and Steve Bannon. We see photos of Bill Clinton on Epstein's plane, a fake Austrian passport with Epstein's photo and a different name, listing Saudi Arabia as his residence. We saw details about how the DOJ's own prosecutors were ready to indict Epstein in 2007 with charges against his assistants as well. And then Alexander Acosta, the U.S. attorney, let him take a state plea deal, a sweetheart deal, and allowed him to walk, where Epstein continued to abuse and harm children and traffic people. But here's where it gets even more interesting. We know that NPR did an investigation, and they found that the DOJ has specifically withheld, removed, taken out of the public database pages related to allegations against Donald Trump. We're talking about FBI interview notes, a woman who said Epstein introduced her to Trump when she's around 13 years old. The FBI flagged this internally. They sent it to the Washington field office, and those pages, gone. Not in the release. And let me also remind you, the FBI had deemed this person, the victim, as credible. And they're hiding these files. Also, don't forget, all these files were supposed to be unredacted, but the FBI initially spent a lot of time and resources to redact Donald Trump's name and information about him. And then it went to the DOJ, who's also been hiding. And again, this all goes against the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Those names were not supposed to be redacted. And then the other thing is because NPR, like, again, broke this news, the DOJ, of course, they just declined to answer any of their questions about why. Why were they taking these documents back? Why were they removing them, withholding them, taking them out of the public database that we're all supposed to see? So let me just say this clearly. The whole outrage about Epstein for years has been about powerful men who abused children and faced no fucking consequences. The files are supposed to be about accountability. And the Trump DOJ is specifically protecting Trump. And they're protecting Trump-related files from a law that Donald Trump signed himself. And there was a CNN poll that shows that about like 2/3 of Americans believe that the government is deliberately hiding information. Because it is. And the thing that I just got into it with somebody today on Instagram Threads. And it was one of the most bizarre conversations I've ever had. But this person is a MAGA Trump supporter. And in his profile talked about he had been homeless and then he voted for Trump and then he found a home. And he's a 3-time Trump voter. But as he started with me, I was just minding my business. And he came at me about Donald Trump's innocent. He's innocent. And I mean, it's the same old song and dance with them. And so I was like, okay, but wait. If he is innocent, why is his name redacted? Why are these files being withheld? That is the opposite behavior of someone who is innocent. But then he's also the type of person, well, actually he said, and I thought this was wild, and if you go back to one of my other episodes about MAGA and the Epstein files, he said, I said, don't you believe the survivors? Because he was trying to make the case about why Katie Johnson was, not credible. And I was like, dude, the FBI literally deemed her credible. What do you know that they don't? But then I said, well, we have to believe the survivors, right? Like we have to believe the survivors. And he said, I don't believe anybody who accuses Trump. I was like, I'm sorry, what? And he said, yeah, I don't believe anybody that accuses Donald Trump. I was like, well, why would you say that? And then he said something like, because they hate him. And I was like, you, what? And then he tried to turn it around and say something like, well, do you believe, Virginia Giuffre, she said Trump didn't assault her. And I said, yes. If she said Trump didn't assault her, she said Epstein assaulted her. Yes. Just like I believe Sasha Riley, when Sasha Riley said that they were assaulted by Donald Trump. I believe Katie Johnson, who shared, and there was an eyewitness who corroborated this as well, that she was sexually assaulted by both Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. You got to believe the victims. And once he said that he doesn't believe anybody who accuses Donald Trump, I knew this was he was long gone. But the thing is, and I just don't know, no MAGA, no Trump supporter has still given clarity. If Donald Trump, who is named 1 million times in the files, is innocent or not guilty, why have they spent so much time, money, and resources to hide everything about him in the files? Why? Like, somebody make it make sense. So we have that going on. Then we have the next topic, which is the Save America Act, which if this act should just be called the Waste of Time Act, but here we go. On February 11th, the House passed the Save America Act. That's the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act by a vote of 218 to 213. So it was nearly party line. This is the successor to the SAVE Act, which passed the House last April, but stalled in the Senate. And so what does it do? It requires you to present documentary proof of citizenship. So to have a passport or a birth certificate, plus a photo ID, every time you register or re-register to vote in a federal election. Change your address? You got to prove citizenship again. Change your party affiliation? Same thing. Now, of course, it sounds reasonable on the surface if you buy the premise that there's like a massive non-citizen voting problem. But here's the thing. There isn't. It's not a thing. The Heritage Foundation, not exactly a fucking left-wing org, found 100 instances of non-citizen voter fraud since 2000. That's out of 500 million ballots. That is 0.000007%. Utah reviewed its entire voter registration list, all of 2 million people, and found 1 confirmed non-citizen registration and 0 non-citizen votes. Meanwhile, like who gets hurt by this bill? Well, a lot of people do, actually. About 21 million Americans don't have easy access to the documents that it requires. Over half of registered voters don't have a current passport. 11% can't access their own birth certificates. Married women who change their names need multiple documents. People of color are 3 times more likely than white Americans to lack these documents. Now, Kansas ran a similar law for years, and the result, 12% of applicants, so 31,000 eligible U.S. citizens, couldn't register. It stopped almost no non-citizens, and actually it ended up more citizens were blocked from voting than non-citizens. And then, of course, Trump, in his State of the Union, called voting a privilege. That's the ideology just like laid bare right there. Voting is not a privilege. Voting is a constitutional right, and calling it a privilege is the tell. A privilege is something that can be taken away. A right is something you have regardless of whether the government likes it or not. Which also ties into like the 24th Amendment. There's making people pay or have documents is a poll tax. It would be considered a poll tax, and that is outlawed by like the 24th Amendment. You're asking people to pay for their right to vote. They don't have to. But the thing is, this is solving nothing. This solves nothing. There's no non-citizen voter happening, but it is a way to continue dehumanizing people who are immigrants. That's what it's for. But it also is limiting women, people of color, Americans who have the right to vote. This is who this is really targeting. So this is not solving a problem. The SAVE Act is creating a problem. Now, this bill goes to the Senate next, and it needs like 60 votes to beat the filibuster, and Republicans are apparently floating, nuking the filibuster to force it through. So let's all pay attention to see what happens with that. Then that takes me to ICE and immigration, because that is still a problem. So let's talk about ICE. As of February 7th, there are almost 70,000 people in ICE detention. That is the highest number ever recorded. It's up 84% since Trump took office again. And 73% of them have no criminal conviction. Less than 14% of all arrested had violent criminal records. This came from a DHS internal document that was obtained by CBS, but CBS is real untrustworthy. But just makes me think of, Trump kept trying to sell this, getting rid of the worst, or they're going after the worst of the worst. But their own numbers are showing otherwise. About 40% of those arrested have no criminal record at all. They're in detention for civil immigration violations. Being here without papers isn't even a crime. It's a civil infraction, like a parking ticket. That's all it is. But they're hunted and treated like violent criminals, and they're not. And it's not just the numbers, it's also the methods. NPR did another investigation this week about ISIS surveillance apparatus, and y'all, there's something there that we need to know about. ICE agents are using an app called Mobile Fortify to run facial recognition on people at traffic stops. Yeah, they're using an AI app called Elite, made by Palantir, that functions like their own agents described it as a Google Maps for people who we want to deport. It pulls addresses from DHS databases, but also from medical records shared from other agencies. So let me say that again. The government is pulling your Medicaid records, health insurance data, and feeding it into an app to figure out where to find you for deportation without a warrant. And activists that are monitoring ICE operations have been followed home. Journalists have been photographed. And in one case documented by NPR, an ICE agent followed a woman who was doing rapid response work, drove her home, and sat outside. The message, as she put it, we see you, we can get to you whenever we want you, or whenever we want to. Now, the courts are pushing back in Minnesota. A federal judge found ICE had violated 96 court orders in a single month. In New Jersey, 56 violations were identified through mid-February. And then 2 U.S. citizens, as we all know, Renee Good and Alex Preddy, were killed during the Minnesota operations. And speaking of death, 32 people have died in ICE custody in 2025. 6 have already died in 2026. That's the agency's deadliest stretch in over 2 decades. Now, of course, the Attorney General issued a policy allowing warrantless home entry, so that basically violating the Fourth Amendment, which prevents us from authorities just searching and seizuring us. But they're trying to tell them that they can now do that without a warrant. So ICE is using, instead of a judicial warrant, ICE is using administrative warrants signed by ICE supervisors, not judges, to break down doors. Courts have ruled that this is not a judicial warrant, but ICE is doing it anyway. This is what a surveillance state looks like when it's being built. And the people who built it will not stop with immigrants. Then we have probably one of the biggest things obviously happening right now is the war in Iran. And that's what it is. It's become a war. On February 28th, 2:30 in the morning, Donald Trump posted an 8-minute video on his Truth Social saying that the United States had begun military strikes in Iran. The operation is called Operation Epic Fury. Israel is calling it Operation Roaring Lion. But the stated goal is regime change. And the fact that, Donald Trump, and just the fact that it's called Epic Fury, that he's just a little man trying to sound big. And so he needed big names. Epic Fury. This is a small man who's a pedophile rapist. But anyway, so there have been strikes. Strikes hit Tehran and other cities as well. And the compound of the supreme leader was destroyed. And he was 86 years old. And he was Iran's supreme leader since 1989. So he was killed along with dozens of other senior officials. Iran's response is called Operation True Promise. They launched waves of drones and ballistic missiles at U.S. military bases across the region. So places like Jordan, Kuwait, Iraq, and the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters has been targeted multiple times. 6 U.S. service members are now dead. Trump went on camera and said, and I quote, "There will likely be more." The current death toll at the time of this recording at least, was at least over 1,000 people in Iran, at least 11 in Israel, 6 American soldiers, and 9 others in Gulf states. Israel has dropped over 1,200 munitions in 24 hours. Here's what I need you to understand about the pretext of this thing. The administration claimed Iran was developing weapons of mass destruction and posed a threat to U.S. forces. But the Pentagon told Congress in closed-door briefings that there was no intelligence suggesting that Iran was planning to attack U.S. forces first. American intelligence reports said that Iran's long-range ballistic missiles capability wouldn't exist until 2035 if they chose to pursue it. Does that sound familiar, by the way? Does no evidence of an imminent threat, but we launched a war anyway ring bells? Because I'm old enough to remember 2003. Now, here's the thing. This war was not declared by Congress. There was no declaration of war. The Gang of Eight congressional leaders were briefed before it started. That's the entire Democratic input into a decision to start a major war in the Middle East. And I can tell you, the economic fallout is already starting. Oil prices are going to go up. The Strait of Hormuz, I don't know if I said that right, but through which about 20% of global oil moves, is under threat. Analysts are warning of global inflation and potential recession if this drags on. On February 25th, 3 days before the strikes, Iran's foreign minister said a historic nuclear agreement was within reach. Talks were scheduled in Geneva, talks happened, and then the U.S. launched the war anyway. I don't know how this ends, nobody does, but I know how it started, with a lie about a threat, and a war started in the middle of the night, announced on Truth Social. And the real truth here, because, a lot of MAGA people are going to the internet and saying like, oh, Democrats, the Iranian people are happy and you hate America because you're not happy about it. This isn't about Iran. This is about a president who is a rapist and a pedophile who is trying to do everything and anything to distract us from the Epstein files. So he started this war. And also because Netanyahu is obviously blackmailing him into starting this war. All of this is tied to the Epstein files and how hard they're trying to hide the atrocities of what these fucking sick people have done. Now, I also saw that it's also about oil. So we claimed we took over Venezuela because I guess we can do whatever we want because of their oil. But they have really crude oil. And Iran actually has I don't know, it's like a chemical or a different type of oil, but it helps break down crude oil. And so Iran has been sending this to Venezuela to help them to make their oil. So there's an oil element that's here as well. But ultimately, this is about Trump acquiring power, acquiring money to protect, and also to protect himself and insulate him and his sick, disgusting pedo cabal of people. That's what it's all about. And we're going to pay the price for it. And then the last one is we have to talk about AI and the Pentagon, especially Anthropic and the Pentagon. That whole deal and what happened there. So let's just talk about because this is directly tied to everything that we've been discussing. It's about AI, it's about surveillance, and it's about the government's willingness to threaten companies that don't play ball with them. So Anthropic, this is the company that makes Claude AI, already had a working relationship with the Pentagon. Claude was reportedly used in January in the operation to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. And that's a whole separate conversation. We touched on that. But here's where things went sideways. The Pentagon came back and demanded expanded access so that they wanted unrestricted access. Use the AI for, quote, any lawful purpose. And Anthropic said no. Specifically, Anthropic drew two very hard lines. No using our AI for mass domestic surveillance of Americans, and no using our AI to make autonomous decisions to use lethal force without human oversight. And those sound, maybe in any other timeline, those would sound like reasonable requests, reasonable lines in the sand to draw, right? You'd think the Pentagon would just say, yeah, fine, yeah, we agree, and sign the paper. They didn't. They did not. After a meeting between Anthropic CEO Dario Amati and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, gross, The Pentagon issued an ultimatum. Yeah, an ultimatum. Accept our terms by 5 p.m. Friday or face the consequences. Anthropic said, and I want to read this very carefully to you, that the Pentagon's, quote, language framed as compromises was paired with legalese that would allow these safeguards to be disregarded at will. Quote, so in other words, they offered language that looked like agreement in plain English, but the fine print let them ignore it whenever they wanted. So Anthropic said no, they walked. And within hours, Donald Trump labeled Anthropic a quote unquote supply chain risk, meaning any company, contractor, or vendor that does business with the Department of Defense could actually be barred from using Anthropic's technology. That's an existential threat to a company whose biggest customers include government agencies and large enterprises. But then here's where the plot twist happens. From those same hours, actually it was even the same day, OpenAI swooped in and announced its own Pentagon deal. Sam Altman himself later admitted it was definitely rushed and that the optics don't look good, which, yeah, buddy. But here's why people are furious. Earlier the same week, Altman had publicly voiced support for Anthropic's position, said OpenAI had the same red lines, and then the moment Anthropic was attacked like that and a deal was put on the table, OpenAI took it. The contract OpenAI signed allows for the Pentagon to use its AI for, again, quote, any lawful purpose. It doesn't give OpenAI an independent right to block specific uses the way Anthropic was insisting on. It just says DOD has to follow existing laws. And one legal scholar at George Washington Law pointed out that this does not give OpenAI an Anthropic-style freestanding right to prohibit otherwise lawful government use. And there's a specific loophole that critics have flagged. The contract cites Executive Order 12333. That's how the NSA does its domestic surveillance, by tapping communications outside the United States that involve American citizens. Technically, they argue, it's not domestic surveillance. OpenAI's contract says comply with 12333. Critics say that is the loophole. The public response was remarkable on this. A campaign called Quit GPT went viral, and about 1.5 million people took action. They canceled their subscriptions, switched platforms to Claude, which is Anthropic's AI, and jumped to number one on the Apple Store and the Google Play Store. And ChatGPT on install spiked 295% in a single day. I'm also one of those people. I had a subscription. I got rid of it. I deleted it. I also did a 1-star ranking because, I mean, they're literally trying to kill us. And chat in this AI, I can't believe we're even here. Now, here's the thing about OpenAI. They amended its contract Monday to add more explicit domestic surveillance language after the backlash, but they still actually haven't released the full contract. It's classified. So we can't actually even verify that the guardrails that they're claiming exist. MIT Technology Review put it better than I could. They said, Anthropic pursued a moral approach that won it many supporters but failed, while OpenAI pursued a pragmatic approach that is ultimately softer on the Pentagon. That's the whole thing right there. And I want to be honest with you about what the story is and isn't. This is not the Pentagon saying, like, give us a murder bot. It's more subtle, more dangerous than that. It's the government saying, trust us to not misuse ambiguous contract language. Trust us to surveil you only in ways that are quote unquote lawful. Oh, and by the way, we get to define lawful. And when one company said no, they got threatened into oblivion. That's a story about government power and what it's willing to do to companies that won't comply. And it's happening right now, friend. In the same week we started a war in Iran, and passed a voter suppression bill. This stuff's all connected. The surveillance state doesn't have one face. It is all connected. And one of the things that I think a lot about, and I posted about this on my social media a while ago, but in the 1970s, MIT ran a model called World 3 that predicted when our society would collapse, because society will always collapse. You know, on average, if we say that a society lasts for about 250 years, and then they eventually will collapse. Well, this model looked at things like environmental factors, mostly economic factors, social factors, culture factors, and it predicted, based on how things were going, so think about, again, the economy, capitalism, religion, and the environment, global warming, they predicted that our society would collapse between 2040 and 2050. And we're actually not only on track, but another researcher found that not only we're on track, we're actually now we're ahead of schedule. We are moving ahead of schedule. So all of this, the role of AI in society, and even environmentally, how much water AI is using when we already have a water deficit, and the economy and late stage capitalism and the exploitation of all of us, and this new awareness of this cabal of pedophiles who run the world, and these sick elite people in power who have told us and showed us we are disposable because this is their world and we're just their little minions. This is all connected, and it's just important that we, at some point, we need to rise up. Okay, deep breath. Let's land this, because I could go on all day. So this week, we know that the Epstein, the Epstein DOJ is hiding files specifically about Trump. The House passed a voter suppression bill that could disenfranchise 21 million eligible Americans. ICE is using AI and your Medicaid records to find and deport people, 73% of whom have no criminal record. We started a war with Iran, and the Pentagon threatened an AI company into oblivion for refusing to let the government use its technology for mass surveillance and autonomous weapons, then found another company willing to sign a softer deal. Links to everything, sources, advocacy orgs, know your rights resources, they're on the show notes. You can also find them free on my Patreon account, which is a free account. I believe knowledge is power. I am angry about all these things that are happening and what people are getting away with and what we've become. But I also want to make sure we have tools so that we're knowledgeable, so we know what's going on. So check out the show notes. Check out my Patreon. It's all free. I believe that we should be sharing information, and I don't believe in fucking paywalls for this kind of stuff. So check that stuff out. I'd also say, if you found this episode useful, share it. Tell someone. That's the point. Let's keep talking. We're all on the same page. I know a lot of us just want to see this end. I, for one, am also really just waiting for the big, beautiful obituary. But I think we'll get through this together. So share this episode if there's something that resonated with you. I'm Valdet Salimai. This is Radical Leftist Scum. Stay mad, stay organized, and I'll see you next time.